Hi, and welcome to the Capability Challenge. Today, I'm here with Caleb. We're doing a joint piece together. He runs the Nobody Built This For You interview series. And together with the Capability Challenge, we're looking at not only how do people need to act differently as we start transforming towards an AI era, but how do you build the systems and processes? How do you measure what's required for both the corporate, but also for the SME businesses? Caleb, maybe you want to just give a brief introduction of yourself and your organization. I'll do the same.
Thanks so much. It's really great to chat with you. I think we've had a lot of great discussions off the camera, so really looking forward to this one on the camera. So I'm one of the co-founders of Kai. Our focus is helping mid-market businesses roll out AI, and we do that using a tool that helps discover how the processes work, what are the bottlenecks, and we help companies automate those bottlenecks. So I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about that in the coming minutes.
Yeah, and so myself, Stephane Alberth, coming from Aixa, we actually go and spend a lot of our time on the human element, trying to help people understand what does it take to help someone go from their current role and their current set of knowledge and skills and capabilities into where they will need to be successful in a world which is transforming rapidly. We've had lots of different people on the Capability Challenge interviewed already over the past 2 months. And I'm really excited today because I think in this conversation, our past conversation, we've always gotten down into a little bit the nitty gritty between what's the difference between a corporate and an SME, in their approaches, and how can they actually drive rapid, valuable change, and what's needed to make that successful. So maybe just an introductory question for you. When we think of these SMEs, especially, which don't have the massive budgets that we see in corporate to drive transformational change and AI, where should these, mid-market organizations even start? What's their first step?
Yeah, no, that's something it's a challenge for most of our customers. I think there's a few standard avenues out there. Historically, you just go out and work with a few standard vendors. So this is very common in mid-market. There's often vertical ERP systems, vertical specific vendors that will just take it on all for you. And that's one way to do it, is let the vendors bring it to you and just sit back and wait. In this wave of AI, we find there's a lot more customers just experimenting, right? Like, hey, let's just install ChatGPT, Claude, and see what happens, right? Let's deploy it to everyone, and people start building skills and building demos, and let's see how that goes. And the last big category we see is organizations bringing in consultants. So in the SME space, they can't afford the big four, they can't afford McKinsey, BCG, but there is a tier of small scale and bespoke consultants that are focused on that tier. I think just from what I've seen and from what I've seen with our customers, there's a few very important things. One is just building internal buy-in. So how do you get everyone excited? In the media, there's a lot of negativity about what AI means and what it could mean for the future of work and the future of your job. So I think it's, from what we've seen, it's important to show people that at least today, a lot of what AI is an enabling tool. It helps people work more efficiently and to get rid of the rote work. And so I think as people get comfortable with this being a tool with real limitations rather than some magic replacement for their role, is, I think, an important starting point. And these are also organizations that don't have a lot of experience. It's not like enterprise where you have a transformation team and every 2 years there's a new system coming through. This is, it's very different. They don't have that built-in expertise, or there aren't engineers on staff in most cases. There aren't consultants on the payroll, and so they need to they really need to build the muscle for how do you actually execute on change, and especially if you're looking for real material savings. You're not just going to get it by deploying the technology. You're going to have to change the way you work to achieve that. So I'll pause there. I know you.
Yeah, look, I love what you're saying. If you think back to it, there's so many goals of doing the work that you just described. Some of it is purely from what you're saying. It's just about learning, just giving the people the time to be hands-on, giving them the practice. It's almost like it could be part of a learning path if you designed a learning path that way, but it sort of just seems to be like an ad hoc first pass is to say, hey, here's some technology, just go back and just start playing with it. And then we're going to start thinking about what we can really do with this later on. And then it seems like it gets a bit trickier. Then you say, okay, well, now we want to hit some KPIs and create some value and drive some benefits. Once you get past that like pure learning phase and you're really focused on, measurable savings, where do you typically start? Like, is it okay, let's get the technology in, or let's fix the processes first, or let's do a deep consulting piece to understand the deeper problem, or how do we redesign this completely from AI from the ground up? I mean, there's different ways to approach this. For an SME, how do you typically do it?
Yeah, so I think the first and best solutions to tackle. So, first there's that discovery. And I think, honestly, your best option for that is get ChatGPT, Claude, whatever, your AI agent tool of choice, deploy it to staff within limits. You don't make sure that you're on the, call it $20 a month plan, not the $2,000 a month plan. But quality of life improvements are a great place to start. So just, a lot of the rote work. Sometimes you can give it to staff and they can just simply use Claude skills or what have you to take care of some reports, but that quickly becomes limited. And what you find with mid-market, and certainly once you get to enterprise, is it's very collaborative. It's not enough to just let everyone have their own tool and kind of automate things in the way they think. To deliver value to your customers, to fulfill orders, to deliver on tickets, you actually need to work together. You can have maybe half a dozen people involved across 3 different teams. And so then you need governance. You need to understand what is the overall flow of work between teams. And so that's where I think it's extremely important to do a deep dive and to really understand where are we today. Historically, you would do that by bringing in a consultant or having someone internally go talk to staff. The gold standard is visits. And so if you're small enough, if you're a small company, 20 people in one room, yeah, you can just essentially sit there with the team and observe what's going on. That goes a very long way. But once you become mid-market, there's multiple locations, there's hundreds of people, that no longer becomes feasible. And so then you need a tool to actually understand not just what's the 80%, what's the most common, but what are the exceptions? What are the unique things you do for your largest customers? Because if you neglect those, then that's what ends up happening is either your customer service suffers or the tools don't work and your staff have to interject. And that becomes a real problem. And so that's where Kai gets involved. We can, we help with that discovery portion. And but I can't help emphasize enough in 2026, you don't have to just guess, build something, see it fail and iterate. You can actually understand upfront. You can actually dig into how it works. And the old adage, measure twice, cut once. Weirdly enough, in software, we don't measure at all. We just start cutting. And so I think it's important that the businesses that are most successful understand that first. They understand what's the potential ROI. Where should you invest? There's all these different ideas. I'm sure every business you go into, there's dozens, hundreds of ideas. All of them are good, but which ones should you do first? which ultimately deliver the most P&L value and to help guide you towards the future path of what the business will be in 12 to 18 months.
So
So
if
I'll pause
you,
there. What's your
yeah,
thought?
if you take on, let's say, I'm just going to go a bit deeper there because I think anyone who's running an SME would be like, okay, so what are the best? What are the best projects? Which ones should we be focusing on? Have you seen some critical, like like real repetitive signs of these? Every single organization ends up doing these 3 to 5 things in terms of initial AI integration or automation.
Yeah, it does depend on the industry. I think the lowest, often the best place to look is just what are the repeated emails that people are sending out. Are they sending a lot of manual notifications and reports? And that's often a great place to look for, where people will spend hours sending out relatively similar emails, and they have to do some upfront work to research across, they'll look in SharePoint, they'll look across their CRM system, they'll look across ERP, and they'll write a responding email. And so
Remember,
that's usually,
just
yeah.
to throw in there, remember that with some of the work that came out of McKinsey, one of the first things they started automating, with their AI tool was exactly that, was their email responses, so that they could, if someone came in with an inquiry, they could get back to them with either a completed or like a 98% completed email within an hour from a partner or a director in the organization, but with a lot of AI help.
Exactly. And I think it's really important that you can't just have Copilot spit out a response based on the email. Actually writing those emails, those responses, requires research. It requires thought. So it is a little bit more involved with that. The other big one is obviously copy and paste. So it's actually surprising when you measure how much time people spend moving information from A to B. They're downloading files, they're uploading them, they're copying and pasting back and forth. That creates errors, it's slow, and just humans are really bad at copying information from A to B. And a lot of that was just a hangover of integrations are very expensive and they're fragile. And one of the advantages of this AI era is the cost of those has gone down dramatically and the capability has gone up. So in cases where the economics, it just didn't make sense to integrate systems, now
So
it can make sense to do that.
just to be clear, like the cost to create the integration has gone down significantly, because you can just power up AI to fill in all the blanks in a certain way and make sense of what needs to be done. But the cost of actually then delivering each of those iterations has probably gone up a lot, since you now are paying for AI resources rather than simple just data swaps.
So yeah, so there's a couple. One of the interesting things with this AI revolution is, sorry to use the word revolution, but it has had significant impacts. There is direct usage of AI. So there's, hey, you can throw things in Claude and it'll spit out answers. But more valuable, and especially in the last 6 months, the labs have been focused on creating, I call it like full self-driving coding. They're really just creating the best, fastest possible coding agent at scale. And so what that means is the cost of developing deterministic code, like just the same code that you could have built 10 years ago, it's cheaper and easier to build. And because of that, it drives the cost down, both of the initial development as well as maintenance. And so what that means is the best practices that we're seeing for integrations, and I'm involved in, we do some of this, and I'm involved in a startup that really emphasizes this, is you can get a high quality frontier model to do the initial integration and copy data back and forth. But then in some ways, it almost compiles it into more traditional code. And that code is much more reliable. It's just orders of magnitude. It's cents to run rather than dollars each time. And the nice thing is you can still have the model act as kind of the assessment, almost in the same way as if I have an engineer, I could get them to manually copy data back and forth. But what would they do? They would do it once, and then they would write a script to do it. And so that's really the intelligent way of doing it. And so we're seeing, we do some of that, but there's a lot of vendors out there that can support that.
Basically getting the best of both worlds, getting the best of the speed and the flexibility, but the low cost of doing a predefined integration path.
Exactly. And I think that's really the future, is not this just, throw it all in Claude. That's just not, it doesn't even make sense to do, in the same way that, you wouldn't take the most brilliant PhD in your company and give them all the work. You can define processes, you can define standards, and then spread that out across a much larger, across the larger org.
And what do you think is going to be, so beyond a lot of this very sort of basic work, just, doing some basic creation for individuals, creating some emails, some simple processes around comms, redefining integrations in a smarter way and having better and faster and more integrations than could be economic before. What do you think are the next steps, the ones that you're starting to see as growing in need now that even the tech is getting better?
Yeah, it's interesting. I follow, there's a great financial analyst, Mike Green, and he talks about the Industrial Revolution and how the first phase was, hey, we're essentially getting better sewing machines. So in the factories, everyone's a bit faster. And then the second phase, after about a decade, was actually, well, how do I get all these craftsmen, these artisans, to build tools to do the work? And so I think after those kind of initial low-hanging fruit that you talked about and that we talked about, then there's this question of, well, what if we were to start again, given the current technology? And there's a whole cohort of AI native startups that do that now. The entire investment thesis for venture for them is, it is literally easier to start a new business from scratch and rebuild our go-to-market, rebuild our customer base, just because it is so hard to change the organization internally. That, there's literally tens of billions of dollars backing that thesis. And I take the other side of that. I actually think there's a real, the problem is not lack of will. Some of it is lack of expertise, but a lot of it has been lack of tools. And so that's really where we're investing, is to say, hey, when it comes to actually understanding and being able to rethink your business. So an example of that is, we ran through our Ops X-ray process with a bill audit customer. And of course, you find a lot of the usual things of, there's a lot of time being spent responding to emails to follow up with very predictable queries. Okay, great. There's spreadsheets that should be integrated. So there isn't a lot of copying and pasting. But then we sat down with them, and the question becomes, well, it's that big vision picture of, if you were to start over again, if you were to imagine yourself as an AI native version of your company, how would you do it all over again? And I think that's an extremely important exercise, but you can only do it once I think you have to do the initial discovery work first. So everyone's on the same page about the way things work today. You need to have a few quick wins just to get, just to help the team understand the capabilities. And then you can have that big picture discussion. Unfortunately, I see a lot of mid-market companies trying to cut straight to, okay, here's our big new system that's going to solve all of our problems. And that kind of big strategic bet, it's dangerous to just go straight in. I think you need to work your way up to that, get some quick ROI wins first, and work toward that rather than trying to go straight there. It's just, I haven't seen that work successfully. The jury's still out, but maybe
it's super difficult, isn't it? Because companies have spent decades, or in some cases hundreds of years, building this company that's built around humans, essentially. And it's the humans that are the organization, that are the communication, that are the structure, that are the knowledge and skills of the organization. So I think they've got a lot more to lose.
Yeah.
Do
you mind?
And upside.
Do you mind if I ask you? Do you mind if I ask you a question there? So when we've gone with this through a few customers, the technical side of how to rebuild the business is AI native. It's not easy, but it's very clear how that can happen. The bottleneck we've always seen is actually the organizational side of things. How do you need to rethink job descriptions. You need to, change roles in some cases, maybe even the remit of teams. And that's, I think, the part that scares companies, rightfully so, is how do you get from A to B without, losing your best people, or, how do you make sure that everyone can effectively move along? And I know that's an area where you have a lot of experience. So I'm just curious to get your take around what works. What have you seen? What are the challenges you've seen, the pitfalls, and what are the kind of the best practices you've actually seen work in practice?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about completely transforming a business or a business area into something completely new. I think there's often this sort of two-speed view. Like, can you be incrementally improving and driving the tanker, and then have a speedboat attached to it trying to work out how to move? And some organizations really believe in this two-speed organization. It's like you can have one company can do both at the same time, and the leadership in particular have to be able to think in terms of slow and fast. The traditional business and the new business. In reality, and this goes well, and this is nothing to do with AI. This is really just to do with transformation. If you think in the energy sector, with EVs and renewables, in many companies, in like the large German and European energy companies, they really started splitting the businesses out because they couldn't intelligently keep them together. They couldn't ask the same people to run the traditional business, and you guys run this new business, but you all have to report into the same people, leverage the same processes. And when we see startups integrating with corporates, you often see these same issues. It all sounds like a great idea, and then you put them under the one roof, and basically the corporate process typically kills the speed and agility of the fast moving organization. And here I think what's at risk is even higher, because you have an organization which is built, and its power comes from tens of years of processes and tooling and people and skills and culture that has been structured to be able to deliver something in a certain way. And other people are building something which is so completely different, that maybe you only need 4 experts and a handful of technicians, AI experts and software development to be able to deliver what maybe 100 people could before. So you're changing from being a people-based operation to being a technology-based, and I think it'd be super hard for one organization to capture all of that. And so I think it's a real strategic decision. Do you, one, try and keep it all together, make everybody more AI literate, do that incremental piece, try and get enough momentum, and then teach people to be more agile, teach people to spend 10% of their time around learning and building their capabilities, so that they can jump from role to role to role and stay within the organization and make the culture even better. Is that even possible? Or do you say that it's actually going to be too much work, and you want to build the speedboat and have it run completely separately? And I think that's a strategic question. I don't know if there's a clear answer for which one will work better. But I mean, if we look, let's say, at Tesla, which is a AI and new tech company, and then you see all of the traditional automotive manufacturers, and you see how hard it was for them to basically build up their EV business on top of what they were doing before, because that's so much to lose, and the culture was so locked in the traditional way of building cars that I think it was almost like a lost decade. They weren't able to keep up or catch up, and maybe if they had done a better job of segregating, even maybe a small $1 billion business at the time, 10 years ago, to just make amazing EVs, they could have actually done a lot better than what they did in the end.
So thinking, I think at the enterprise level, there's a different scale, a different set of challenges there. So, and different set of resources. You know, splitting out a separate entity that's more viable than, you know, some of the mid-market companies we work with. It's just not financially nor operationally practical to do that. One of the interesting things to see is the jury's out on how well this works, but just the champion building. So a lot of it's like, hey, Gary, hey, Neil, our goal is to scale you. And so just, you know, kind of finding the best person on the team, the person who's most engaged, and just kind of championing them and saying, hey, our goal is to, you know, help scale you. I think, and this works particularly well at organizations that are naturally growing, where it isn't, you know, it's not zero sum. You're not trying to cut costs. You're the business is growing anyway. You need extra capacity. So that works well, but just really driving buy-in from the, you know, the most critical one or two team members, and then you know, even in some cases just trying to like name it after them, for example, you know, the Gary's the AI. So but yeah, I'm curious, what are other, go ahead.
Just a critical point there, like small companies can do that because they're not limited by the market in most cases, unless they're completely niche. Even then, you know, they can be agile and they're usually less complicated. So they can do one or the other probably quite easily. Like if you've got a 500-person business, you can maybe take 3 people and say, you know what, with AI today, you can go build me our company in a box. You've got 3 months, you got all the AI tools that you want. Rebuild our company from scratch and see if we can replace and automate all of our processes. Because it's, you know, there's not like usually 2,000 processes. There's like usually a handful of core business processes that they need to do. And, you know, they could, I think it's even easier for SMEs down that route if they want to, but the business itself is typically simpler. And if they do it in the right way, they can grow their market. They can bring the rest of the company in there. So, you know what, we've now worked out how to be 10 times more efficient. But guys, now we have to start transforming your roles to be able to work in this new way of working. And it's then two business models even that could maybe work in parallel. I saw one of my consulting clients in Geneva, totally different business, but he had like a very traditional physiotherapy business. And on the one hand, he had his traditional business with his clinics, etc., and he wanted to do something much more digital, and people could move around and they could treat people at home, and you know, they didn't need you know, offices or clinics. They could work much more agile way. Everything could be done based on internet bookings and so on. And he actually built these 2 different business models, and then he cross-pollinated them. And that, you know, you have people that you can move from one to the other, and then just run them as 2 separate businesses. And I think very successfully, because, you know, like in many of the other transformations we've seen, just because the new business model comes, it doesn't mean that the old one is no longer needed. So I think small businesses can really be super agile. They can grow, they can create their own wind essentially, because, you know, they're not living in the sort of like, I have 30% of the market, you know, and we have to fight for every percentage we steal from someone else. If you've got 0.05% of the market going to 2% or 1%, you know, even that isn't a big change.
So one thing, I think you keep using the word transformation, and so that's very familiar for enterprise buyers. But I think when when you're talking about mid-market, a lot of leaders, and almost certainly unless you came from enterprise, you don't even know what that means. And I think there are some important lessons to be learned from that. Number one is that it's not just 3 months and you're done. I'm sorry, anyone selling you that is just it's not true. Unless you have a very small business, like it's literally everyone can fit in a small, around a 5-person table. It's not going to happen. It's going to take you more time than that, both in terms of change management and in terms of the technology. Not to mention your customers are going to change. Your vendors are going to change how they work. So it's, when the word transformation, it implies that this is a process, not just a one and done destination. So I think it's very important to have that going in. Otherwise, you'll feel disappointed. You will spend 3 months and your business won't be AI native. And
Definitely
so, yeah, exactly. But I think just as a point of education, you have a lot of experience with transformation, with operational and digital transformation, which was prior to AI, but in a lot of ways, it's very similar. Maybe kind of give the primer for a mid-market executive on, what does that look like, and what are the parts that are relevant to mid-market, even where they don't have the budget, there isn't the resources, not as much time, but what almost, maybe the next step even is, what would you describe as sort of the minimum viable transformation team or stack for a mid-market company?
I'd go the other way around. So my experience with mid-market is you go in there with a value proposition first. So maybe you can spend a week and invest a week to understand what that value is. But within that first week, you need to come out with saying, hey guys, this is where you are today. We can move here and this will be the saving. So this doesn't sound good typically for your major step change. This, you can't do this when you talk about building a speedboat, because that's inspirational kind of work, or aspirational. Like, could you imagine a world? That's like building a startup, and that's not your typical come in, we're going to build this incredible thing for you and it will work, because nobody knows whether it'll work or not. In fact, the people in the organization will probably know best whether their process and their business model could really be transformed into this AI native thing easily. That's more on them. And then for the rest of it, I think it's multiple incremental improvements to say, we can take you out, we can take out this much cost, provide this much growth, this much benefit in a certain amount of time.
Yeah, one thing, you mentioned you have 1 week to figure it out. Is that a fundamental constraint, or is that more of a constraint of the economics? It's that, hey, if you're a large company, you can afford to have a consultant for a long period of time. But if you're working with mid-market, we can only afford 1 week of a consultant time, and therefore we're trying to do what we can in a week because of the economics. Like, is it fundamentally that it should only take a week and it does only take a week, or that they're kind of being shoehorned into a budget constraint?
I think like mid-market companies need to be much more pragmatic. They don't have the time, the mental space, the team's mental space. They don't have all of this flex of just creating a separate team that are going to think about that while everyone does their business. If you go in there and you're really trying to improve something, you're going to be disrupting their business. So I think for me, it's like it might be multiple times, or it might start to be continuous. But if you can't within a week show them where the money is, and that becomes the argument to continue, then it can be really dangerous for an SME to be like a small to mid-sized company to be basically investing their time and their focus on something where no one really knows if it's going to add value yet. So I think for me, that's one of the big differences. For an SME, it has to add value, like, from the get-go, and has to be absolutely clear the path to value. Now, if you can get more value, if you can do it incrementally and stepwise and keep on doing that, and then it becomes part of a continuous process, is fine. But, you don't start with a 5-year continuous process improvement, consulting project. No, you go in there, you prove you can create value, and they will keep you there until you basically have completed everything you can find, and and you've proven that everything you find you can deliver, then you found everything that's there, and and then maybe they'll keep you on and say, hey, well, let's think about something much more strategic. Let's take some time. We've cleared out everything we can. We found all the easy wins. What's the next big win that we can chase? What's that big strategic piece? And that can be longer term.
And then tactically, what is the mix of skills and what are the elements of the transformation that need to happen for it to be successful? It isn't as simple as, hey, Claude, automate this, and away it goes. Or frankly, even just getting a perfect purpose-built solution and just saying go. There's a lot more involved in making sure that's successful, especially on a sustained basis. So maybe, again, if you can give sort of the primer for mid-market executives about what that looks like.
Yeah. So when I built up my current company, Aixa, that all came out of like a really simple problem. So, I'd spent 5 years, working in sort of Strathouse companies like McKinsey, building, strategies, trying to bring in the ideas of where organizations change, very large corporate, very top down. We saw some amazing wins in that time, but a lot of the time, that sort of, it's like moving a ship. You might move it 1 or 2 degrees left or right. I then spent a bunch of years with very different type of consulting, where they basically said, companies know what they need to do. If you ask the people, they will know what the fix is and what's broken. What they are having trouble with is basically driving that transformation and getting it through, because there's lots of different views. There's not enough prioritization, not enough data, not enough fact base, and not enough clarity of who's going to do what in a really structured, organized way that you can actually get a lot of these things done in a very focused, stepwise manner. And what was amazing is the amount of value that process can give. And I think that works for any kind of learning challenge. And it was a lot about capability change, like teaching people skills to work and act differently in order to be able to capture all of the benefits that were there. And a lot of the benefits were behavioral change benefits in any case. And you think of AI, it could be, hey, do I write this all by hand, or do we have to actually teach people? No, we don't want you to be writing this by hand anymore, but we do want you to review it really carefully and want to teach you how to get the best out of this thing. So instead of it taking you 4 hours to write, you can spend 15 minutes preparing all the data and getting Claude or whatever to write it for you, and then you spend another 30 minutes refining and getting it perfect, but you've just saved 75% of your time. Be sort of a behavioral change approach to Claude, let's say, in the business. And driving that change was actually all about people. So you can, we had some amazing methodologies, etc., and they were relatively simple. The real difference was not the methodology. Of course, you needed that, but what actually created the value was sitting down with people, behind their shoulder and say, yeah, now try this, and here's the basic methodology. Have you got that? Now, what would you do in this situation? Let's practice it. Let's run through this. And basically, handhold through the first examples, then get them to lead and support them through the second round, and then finally step back and let them do it. And that's why, as a consultancy, we're actually being paid very significant, sums for projects, because we could create so much value for these mid-sized organizations, or like, let's say a BU level of a much larger organization. So I guess the point is, what we found was the ability to learn, the ability to take on new ways of working, to rebuild processes, to be adaptive were hugely valuable. And the specific tool or the methodology that we were using was table stakes. You had to have it, and it does add value, but it was actually the way that we integrated that into the process. And so when I was originally thinking about starting a consultancy tool that would help SMEs deliver their own consulting value without the need of a consulting company, I instantly realized that that would fail until we could create that sort of consulting capability layer, which was more human, because it really had to work not just with knowledge, but it had to work with humans, and that was our sort of push towards digital humans, voice and digital human interaction, so that we're not just sharing learnings, but enabling people to actually change their own behaviors.
So, digging into that, if you're a mid-market exec, maybe you don't know what the transformation dream team looks like. So if you were to, let's assume you're not using some of the modern tools. You were just, hey, I need to get a team together. So is it just I have a quote unquote forward deployed engineer? I just sit some engineer down with my best person, and is that the team? Is there a project manager? Is there a business analyst? What are the different roles that you would think about? And then maybe what are the tools that would either replace or supplement those roles? So you know what I mean? You're the coach for the transformation ulcer team. Who are the, what are the roles? Who are you putting on the team?
It's a really hard one to answer, because I look around and I see a bunch of startups building AI tech and doing a really good job, but they're not as connected with the traditional businesses. So they're sort of, as a startup, it's one thing, it's easier to build. And there you kind of need, some clear visionary and the support of some good tech people who know how to use AI to accelerate the whole development process. And then when I think of the large corporates at the other end of the equation, the biggest killer that you see are lots of playing around and no actual doing and no converting. So we've got to become more AI. Let's test out these 100 tools. They're all wonderful, but we're not going to do any of them because we can't change our processes anyway. So, well, there we go. That was like 100 times $50,000 that was thrown out the window, and all of the energy of all of these people that are trying to be the change makers in their organizations, basically being killed, like the process being killed due to corporate inability to actually deliver the change. Too many compliance steps in every part of the flow. Doesn't matter if you're doing a $500 or a $5,000 POC or a $5 million sale, you have to follow the same process and the same compliance steps and so on. That can be a big issue. The other issue is organizations want it, but there's so many decision makers that you can never get everybody to agree that you're going to take on this new technology. And without that either decision coming up front, very often all of that effort into creating the proof of concept and the pilot then gets thrown out, because it's very difficult then to get an actual green light to continue. So we're seeing lots and lots of wasted effort. So I think there, especially at the larger scale, you need to work out ways to simplify it, whether you choose like a process that you implement it end to end, and you get it running, and you kind of have this as the strategy before you even start doing like any real pilot work. You say, okay, we have a problem, we know we can fix it, let's work out the best way to do it, and then we implement it completely, and then we just measure that limited implementation and then scale from there. And that's what I've seen one great company that I'm working with at the moment do. They did the POC, that a structured way of evaluating. They're going into pilot, but that pilot is basically part of a future potential continuation. They have multi-year plans, and it's basically you prove it works, it just keeps on growing from that point. But that came from having, this is the critical piece, having one visionary in the organization.
Yeah.
One visionary, and then some support. That's it. You just need the one visionary, and that's the most important person. Maybe some process management support if it's a larger company or whatever, but it all comes down to that one visionary who has been able to create alignment up to the decision-making power. And a small company, that's great, because that visionary might report into the CEO, to the CTO. So you basically have him and one person above him, but if they both say it's great, it gets done.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm just thinking through to, the mid-market companies we work with, and the things that are successful. Yes, having that visionary spark. When we say visionary, it's not enough to just picture the end state. It's someone that deeply understands the problem, that deeply understands the technology limitations, because I think there are a lot of visionaries out there who don't actually understand what's possible today, only what's theoretically possible in the future of AI. And so that's very important. But, even some of the basic things like having a project manager, having someone who actually owns the results, making sure that there's, things stay on track. That's extremely important. Like you mentioned, the change management and training, that's extremely important, because what we see with a lot of these is you'll pick one or two champions. So someone internally in the organization who deeply understands the business. They're kind of a design
They already
partner.
said something that scares me. You said you pick one or two champions. The second that you've picked one or two champions, you've already lost, because the true champions would pick you.
Fair enough.
That's the challenge. That's the challenge. And I've seen exactly this happen, in my life multiple times. It's like, okay, great. Now we need, we have the visionary, and the visionary knows he understands the traditional business. He's evolved his thinking to understand the AI capabilities, and he knows how to get from A to B. And then he's like, okay, great. Who's going to volunteer to be the champion? You. Done. Beautiful. and at that point, it's, everything gets pushed back about 6 months, literally, because the volunteered person, the champion, is rarely anywhere near as good as the as that initial person that had that vision, because he understands the core, he understands the AI, he understands how to get to A to B. That's the person you really want to have by your side. And as much as possible, you want them to own the outcome, you want them to own the process, and you want them to own the change management procedure, and even those weekly, monthly, whatever touch points to have the success. If they aren't connected to that, things start to fall apart, because it's usually such a deep change, and it's very integrated into all of the daily work, that person becomes the critical.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I was saying that, I meant the Megan, the Gary, the person that's been at this for 25 years. They're on the front lines. If basically, if you go into the business and you say, who's the most knowledgeable person here? Like, who really understands how everything works? It's never going to be an executive. It's almost never going to be an engineer or someone in IT. It's going to be someone on the operations front. And so I think it's very important that, those folks are closely engaged, especially if you are focused on a particular team, a particular role. You need at least one person who's working very closely with the team, in conjunction with the more technical staff. But I think the ones that might be underestimated are the, just the simple project management, kind of business analyst, figuring out exactly how things should work, and organizing and prioritizing different requirements. Just having an engineer working together with that business person may or may not work. It really depends on the skill set that engineer has. And then, as you mentioned, the transformation and change management element has to be very thoughtful. This is, it's very hard to be agile with HR, with people, especially with changes of this magnitude. And so I think it is, and that's something where you have a lot of expertise and add a lot of value, but that's that's an area where you very much, you can't neglect it, and have to be thoughtful upfront about how you're approaching it.
I think that human capability change layer is usually the add-on that gets done after the project has been defined.
Yeah.
And arguably, if you're talking about, every 10 years you change your SAP system or something, and once every 10 years you have to change, and then you have to have the change management process that goes with that. I think then it kind of is okay. It can work. If you're talking about putting people around AI transformation, just going to get faster and faster. So
Yeah.
I think the critical bit, and what I, at the farm on is, that it's just that human capability change there, that human velocity of learning is going to be so critical in the future that it's not an afterthought. It's actually first thought to get that base layer of human capability building, in the system, and then every one of these interventions, improvements, changes, of whether it's a tool, a process, if you're really going to incrementally transform a traditional business into something competitive with an AI native business, then you're going to have to just move very quickly, continuously. And it's not going to be one change, it's going to be a muscle of learning, a muscle transformation from where you are today to whatever the future brings. And I think that's going to be the critical piece. What exactly are those capabilities? I mean, obviously, learning, the ability to learn, and is going to be is obviously there. And the ability to have the capacity for change is going to be there. You're much closer to the ground than I am, much closer to all of these many different transformations. The question I actually had for you was, what do you think are going to be those change skills and capabilities that are most important over the next few years, let's say, slightly longer time horizon, with all of the changes that you are seeing and implementing?
Yeah, I mean, for many of the businesses we deal with, the hardest thing to change is the pace of change. So, a lot of, I think of logistics and healthcare, in a lot of cases, people have been doing very similar things for 5 to 10 years. It just doesn't change that quickly. And so the notion that, oh, my tools are going to be every 2 weeks, it's improving, it's changing, there's something new and I have to provide feedback. That's a very foreign notion. If you're at an AI native company, you're just used to the ground's always moving, and that's just, I come in the morning and there's new things and I roll with it. And a lot of mid-market businesses, that's foreign. That kind of just the mental idea that it's not, there aren't these static systems and processes that, and I'm just a cog in, and it's that these are constantly changing. I can provide feedback to improve them. Others are providing feedback. And so I'm constantly learning. I'm looking for areas of improvement. And so I think that's at many of the businesses we see, that's one of the most difficult things to change and to impart. And some people take to it very naturally. They're just, great, this is fun, this is exciting. And for others, it's less comfortable. They'd rather have more predictability, and so I think there's a real change management question there. And how do you build that comfort with change? That's probably the biggest thing I see. I think the specific technical needs, people can pick that up, but it's just that the notion of it's changing, and the nature of I think one of the things that I really pushed for, advocated at a couple of companies we're working with, is actually changing incentive structures and performance reviews. So it's not just about how quickly did I do this task, it's also, did I provide useful feedback that helped improve the system and process? And the nature of the role changes. It's not just someone is, they're not just a dispatcher, they're not just working on authorizations or billing. Your job is to, yes, do this, but also to improve the way it is done, make it more consistent, make it faster, make it better. And that's actually a change, it's a change in the job description, it's a change in the incentive structure. And I think that is just extremely, extremely important. And unfortunately, in many cases, I think it's neglected.
Yeah. So one last question for you. I think we're coming to the end of our time. If you were to have to bet on one side or the other, you can't say both. Would you put your money on, for a client, that they automate more work, or that they build the muscle of being able to continuously reinvent the organization and how they do work?
I mean, I'm literally betting on the latter, that it's more important to be able to have the culture, have the tools, have the processes in place so that you can continually improve. So that as the market changes, as you see new business opportunities, you have new markets, there's M&A opportunities, that you're able to adapt quickly. That's ultimately more important. It's the rate of the learning. It's how quickly your organization learns that ultimately defines who wins. It's not, how good you are today. So that would be, that's my big bet.